conduct attacks inside the country. Nevertheless, the group maintains an intention to carry out attacks abroad. Despite these important achievements, the risk of resurgence by Daesh remains. Since November, the Daesh core has increased its attacks in Iraq and the Syrian Arab Republic, attesting to its resilience and adaptability. In other parts of the world, the threat levels have been raised in several European member states, while in Southeast Asia, the Philippines have faced increasing terrorist attacks. Yet parts of Africa, notably West Africa and the Sahel, remain the most affected by the activity of Daesh and its affiliates. The situation in this region has deteriorated in the reporting period and is becoming increasingly more complex, with local ethnic and regional disputes conflating with the agenda and operations of these groups. As previously reported, Daesh affiliates continue to operate with increasingly more autonomy from the Daesh core. Should this trend of greater autonomy persist, the reports alerts to the risk that a vast area of instability may emerge from Mali to the borders of Nigeria. Countering the threat of terrorism in Africa remains a priority for the United Nations Office of Counterterrorism. The African Counterterrorist Summit, planned for April 2024, was designed to be African-led and African-owned. However, as this process couldn't yet ensure full inclusivity of all African member states, the summit had to be postponed. The Office of Counterterrorism will continue to strengthen its support to African member states and regional organizations, including through our program offices in Nairobi and Rabat. Madam President, Excellencies, while trends and developments outlined in the report are concerning, they also call for reflection and action on at least three fronts. First, the grave implications of terrorism and sometimes of counterterrorism. In addition to immense human suffering, terrorism threatens international peace and security and hampers sustainable development. Moreover, time and again, we have seen counterterrorism measures being misused or creating unintended consequences. To avoid them, it remains crucial to ensure that counterterrorism measures are grounded on international law, including international human rights and humanitarian law. Among these unintended consequences, the dire and deteriorating situation of individuals, mostly women and children, still stranded in camps and other facilities in the northeast of the Syrian Arab Republic, are but one illustration. Important progress has been made in the repatriation of these individuals by a few countries in the reporting period. However, as highlighted in successive reporting, the pace of repatriations remains too slow. I echo the Secretary General's repeated calls for member states with nationals in such facilities to consider the implications of the current situation and scale up their efforts to facilitate the safe, voluntary, and dignified repatriation of those individuals. The United Nations remains available to support member states upon request through its global framework. Second, the limits of counterterrorism operations centered on force. The persistent threat posed by Daesh, despite significant losses, should serve as a reminder that more multidimensional approaches are necessary to address terrorism and its drivers. Force alone is not the answer. Comprehensive responses, firmly grounded on political strategies, anchored in international law, and based on all of government and all of society approaches are indispensable. While member states remain primarily responsible for countering terrorism, there is much to gain from multi-stakeholder engagement in the design and implementation of counterterrorism responses. The United Nations stands ready to work with member states in this regard. The Office of Counterterrorism continues to provide leadership on the General Assembly counterterrorism mandates entrusted to the Secretary General across the United Nations system. In addition, our Global Counterterrorism Coordination Compact ensures coherence and coordination of efforts among its 46 entities, maximizing the impact of our capacity building. And third, the need for prevention. On Monday, 12th of February, we commemorated the Second International Day for the Prevention of Violent Extremism, as and well conducive to terrorism, as promulgated by the General Assembly in its Resolution 77/243. Preventing terrorism from materializing is always more effective than remedying its impact, most especially on human lives. It's also more cost efficient, particularly in contexts where terrorist groups exploit conflict dynamics. Addressing the conflicts itself remains our best hope to mitigate the threat posed by Daesh and other terrorist groups. Further prevention efforts, including through adequate financing, remains indispensable. The United Nations system is adapting its capacity building support to the evolution of the threat highlighted in this report. Our Countering Terrorist Travel Program is now supporting 69 member states, and the new integrated border stability mechanism will provide a coordination platform among United Nations entities and Interpol in West Africa. The global program on fusion cells provides assistance to over 20 member states to strengthen interagency cooperation and coordination. And we are also increasing our support to address the challenges and leverage the opportunities of new technologies, including unmanned aerial systems. I call in this regard on member states to favorably consider the Secretary General's proposal outlined in his policy brief on a new agenda for peace, namely for member states to develop and adequately invest in national and regional prevention strategies to address all forms of violence, including terrorism. Madam President, Excellencies, terrorism is a multifaceted threat. Countering it requires multilateral and decisive efforts. As tensions rise in various parts of the world, let the consensus among member states against terrorism serve to help find common ground, reduce friction, and reaffirm our commitment to multilateral solutions for a better tomorrow. The Office of Counterterrorism, including through the United Nations Global Counterterrorism Coordination Compact, will continue to support member states in their efforts to counter this threat. I thank you.
I thank Mr. Voronkov for his briefing, and I now give the floor to Ms. Natalia German.
Dear Madam President, Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, I'm pleased to brief the Security Council on the 18th report of the Secretary General on the threat posed by Daesh and on the United Nations efforts to support member states in addressing the threat. And I would like to thank the United Nations Office of Counterterrorism, headed by Under-Secretary General Mr. Vladimir Voronkov, the analytical support and sanctions monitoring team led by Mr. Justin Hustvedt, and all other United Nations partners for their close collaboration with the Counterterrorism Committee's Executive Directorate on the report. I also wish to acknowledge the presence of the Secretary General of the International Criminal Police Organization, Interpol, Mr. Jürgen Stock, and thank him for the close partnership that Interpol has maintained with CTED over the years. Madam President, the transnational and decentralized character of the threat posed by Daesh and its affiliates continues to demand a nimble international strategy focusing on multilateralism, information sharing, and cooperation across borders. Daesh and its affiliates are becoming more ingrained in parts of the African continent. They are exploiting the political instability and expanding their radius of influence, their operations, and territorial control in the Sahel, with growing concerns for coastal West Africa. The African continent now accounts for almost half of terrorist acts worldwide, with Central Sahel accounting for about 25% of such attacks. It is a priority of the United Nations counterterrorism architecture to support African member states and partners in addressing these trends. Meanwhile, enduring challenges persist in the Middle East and Southeast and Central Asia, with indications that Daesh is attempting to resurge in those subregions as well. CTED remains committed to supporting all United Nations member states in countering the threat posed by Daesh and its affiliates, including their attempts to regroup. On behalf of the Counterterrorism Committee, CTED assesses and facilitates technical assistance delivery for the implementation of relevant Security Council resolutions on counterterrorism. Based on our recommendations and analysis, several initiatives have been implemented by United Nations Global Counterterrorist Coordination Compact entities to address the threat posed by Daesh and its affiliates. These initiatives include supporting the prosecution, rehabilitation, and reintegration of the individuals in a human rights compliant, gender responsive, and age appropriate manner. Additionally, they involve developing technical assistance plans in support of governments' efforts to prevent and counter terrorism, such as the one recently adopted in Benin. United Nations entities are also engaged in strengthening states' capacity to prevent terrorists from acquiring weapons, protect vulnerable targets, and disrupt terrorist travel under the United Nations Countering Terrorist Travel Program. In addition, United Nations partners act to stem terrorist financing and Daesh use of information and communication technologies, develop counter-terrorist narratives, strengthen the resilience of societies, and support the reconstruction of cultural heritage sites. Madam President, among all this important work, I wish to highlight two areas of priority for CTED. First, addressing the use of new and emerging technologies for terrorist purposes. Incidents around the world demonstrate that terrorists, including Daesh, increasingly use unmanned aircraft systems for intelligence gathering and attacks. These groups' sophistication in producing small-sized and inexpensive weaponized UAS is increasing too. To address this growing concern, in December, the Counter-Terrorist Committee adopted the Abu Dhabi Guiding Principles. These non-binding principles are intended to guide member states in their responses to the threats posed by the use of UAS for terrorist purposes, including against critical infrastructure and soft targets, and provide a framework for United Nations entities to design appropriate capacity-building initiatives. This year, the Counter-Terrorist Committee also expects to adopt non-binding guiding principles on preventing, detecting, and disrupting the use for terrorist purposes of new and emerging financial technologies, as well as information and communications technologies. In light of the rapid technological advances in these fields, public-private partnerships are essential to counter the use of technologies for terrorist purposes. And this is a key finding of CTAD's recent analytical brief on establishing effective public-private partnerships on countering the financing of terrorism that was launched last week. Second, ensuring accountability and justice. This year will mark 10 years since the adoption of Resolution 2178 on the prosecution, reintegration, and rehabilitation of foreign terrorist fighters. Bringing terrorists to justice is an important commitment of all United Nations partners who have continued supporting accountability efforts for the crimes committed by Daesh in Iraq and the Syrian Arab Republic, as well as in the Sahel and Maghreb, and also in Europe. The recommendations and analysis that CTAD provides to member states have also increasingly focused on ensuring accountability and justice for terrorist-related crimes by applying the relevant legal frameworks and to prosecute all acts of violence committed by terrorists. The prosecution rate for sexual and gender-based violence crimes remains low, despite these types of crimes being a recurrent tactic of terrorist groups, including Daesh and its affiliates, as we have seen in Iraq, the Syrian Arab Republic, and in Nigeria. Last November, CTAD published a landmark report entitled Towards Meaningful Accountability for Sexual and Gender-Based Violence Linked to Terrorism. We are grateful to Switzerland for their support in the completion of this important initiative. Madam President, as the threat posed by Daesh and its affiliates evolves and spreads, CTAD will continue to cooperate closely with the member states, United Nations entities, international, regional, and sub-regional organizations, with civil society and the private sector. And I wish to reiterate the full commitment of my office to actively support this Council and its Counter-Terrorist Committee in combating terrorism in all its forms and manifestations. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank Ms. German for her briefing, and I now give the floor to Mr. Jürgen Stock.
Madam President, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored to be given the opportunity to address the Security Council once again on behalf of Interpol and in support of global law enforcement. I would like to thank Guyana for inviting me to speak and for their promotion of gender equality and inclusivity in working towards international security. I've listened with great interest to the briefings of Under-Secretary General Voronkov and Executive Director German on the excellent 18th report of the United Nations Secretary General on the threat posed by Daesh. The report highlights several developments and trends relating to Daesh that are of concern and which align with what Interpol is witnessing every day through the global police network. The first is the opportunistic exploitation of any weakness or gaps in the security landscape, where underlying drivers have led to instability and conflict. Daesh and its associates have been quick to manipulate narratives, expand their presence, and gain influence in communities. Young people are particularly vulnerable to recruitment and exploitation, and women and girls are subject to sexual and gender-based violence. I have listened with horror to the accounts in previous Security Council meetings of survivors like Ms. Murad and Ms. Khalaf as they fight for justice. We know that building skills in sexual and gender-based violence investigations for specialized police and prosecutors is essential. That is why Interpol is committed to bringing a gender perspective to global policing. The second concern is the improvement of Daesh's capabilities, especially through exploiting emerging technologies. Here, our Innovation Center has been focusing on the risks of airborne unmanned systems for 6 years. Interpol also works closely with UNOCT on the CT Tech project to help law enforcement identify and prevent the exploitation for terrorist purposes of enablers such as encryption services, video distribution tools, and new propaganda platforms. A third threat is the alignment with transnational organized crime. In our ENAC project, Interpol builds analytical units in our member countries which collect data, for example, on the trafficking of cocaine through North and West Africa, mostly by sea and along the Sahelian route. Our findings show interactions between terrorist groups and criminal organizations where their interests and areas of operation converge to benefit both sides. The groups operate interdependently without structural connections, but may share connections with smugglers and financiers who may ultimately help expand their capabilities. Madam President, Your Excellencies, since I first briefed the Security Council on foreign terrorist fighters in 2015, the international community has made truly monumental efforts in countering the phenomenon and in implementing Security Council resolutions 2178, 2253, and 2396. In turn, Interpol is fully committed to its role of global information hub as recognized by the Security Council. As a result, Daesh has been greatly diminished but not eradicated. And it is in the darkness that Daesh is most dangerous. Their ultimate objectives and targets are no less ambitious than before. Their aims go well beyond their current spheres of influence. The world was taken by surprise when Daesh leveraged the chaos of war to capture and control large areas of Syria and Iraq in 2014. We must not turn our backs and be lulled into a false sense of security. From a law enforcement perspective, it is about detecting, tracking, and stopping those who fill the ranks of Daesh. To achieve this, Interpol's operational support focuses on three axes: biometrics, border security, and battlefield information. Our biometrics operation last March in Somalia enabled the capture of data on almost 300 terrorist suspects using mobile devices. This additional information pays off at border security checks. For example, during an operation in December in West Africa, an individual at a border crossing point matched with the biometrics of an Interpol alert for terrorism links with a jihadist group. The alert had been issued during a previous Interpol counter-terrorism operation in another African country 3 years earlier. And battlefield intelligence on bomb makers can lead to arrests across continents. Last April, Chilean authorities informed Interpol they had identified an individual subject to a red notice for bringing explosive material into Lebanon and its connection to the 2020 explosion in the port of Beirut. He was arrested in Madrid with a view to extradition to Lebanon. These three elements can be brought together in a single Interpol operation, for example, in November, when 10 countries across Central, South, and East Asia coordinated over 1,700 arrests while disrupting the illicit trafficking of arms, weapons, ammunition, and IED precursor materials, and intercepting foreign terrorist fighters and criminal fugitives moving across borders. Using these practical actions, Interpol will continue to support our 196 member countries and work closely with our United Nations counterparts to disrupt the activities of Daesh. I urge the international community first to share information via Interpol, following the commitments of Resolution 2178 and 2396, to build an accurate cross-regional threat picture through our criminal analysis files, our bioterrorism prevention platform, and UN Security Council Interpol special notices. Second, to run systematic screening checks against Interpol databases at your borders to protect your countries and ensure that Daesh members are tracked and caught. And finally, to ensure the sustainability of Interpol counterterrorism operations and capacity building initiatives, particularly in Africa and Central Asia, as high-priority theaters targeted by Daesh resurgence. Here, we appreciate the support of the United States in our Gemini project, which enables the extension of connectivity to borders in member countries such as Iraq. Madam President, Your Excellencies, in a world which sometimes seems overwhelmed with crisis, it is understandable that we prioritize what appear to be the most urgent conflicts. But we must not let Daesh go unchecked as they continue to cause harm among the most vulnerable. Thank you very much for your attention.
I thank Mr. Stock for his briefing, and I will now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Madam President, and to Undersecretary General Voronkov, Executive Director German, and the monitoring team for your preparation of the 18th Secretary General's report on the threat of ISIL. Thank you as well to Secretary General Stock for your briefing. We remain particularly focused on the increasing terrorism threat across Africa outlined in the Secretary General's report. We share his concern over developments in West Africa and the Sahel, where the situation is deteriorating and becoming more complex with the prospect of greater instability. We continue to provide our African partners critical assistance in disrupting and degrading ISIS and al-Qaeda affiliates in a manner consistent with international law. We welcome the Integrated Border Stability Mechanism launched by IOM, UNODC, and Interpol, which should assist West African governments to strengthen border governance and security cooperation while respecting human rights. Broadly, CTAD's assessments and reports are a critical tool to guide UNCT compact entities' provision of technical assistance. Strengthening of monitoring and evaluation of projects across the CT compact will improve the ability to report on impact and results. We also encourage member states to play an active role in updating and implementing UN 1267 sanctions to counter ISIS and al-Qaeda. Turning to Syria and Iraq, an international coalition is working with local partners to address threats. Attacks on coalition forces, including over 170 attacks in recent months on U.S. forces by Iran-aligned militia groups, directly undermine the international community's ability to prevent ISIS from reconstituting. The United States will continue to work with the Iraqi security forces, including Kurdish Peshmerga forces, to build up their capabilities and prevent an ISIS resurgence. Additionally, repatriation of detained third country national ISIS fighters and displaced persons in Al-Hol and Raj camps in northeast Syria continues to be a top priority for the United States. Repatriation is the most durable solution to the crisis, and it is necessary to prevent ISIS resurgence in the region. The situation in these camps, which have more than 45,000 people, 2/3 of whom are children, constitutes an urgent humanitarian, human rights, and security challenge. We have seen an increase in repatriations over the past 6 months, especially by the government of Iraq, and hope it is a sign of more to come. Addressing conflict-related sexual violence is another U.S. priority. We value the UN's work in supporting survivor-centered investigations and justice and accountability for conflict-related sexual violence linked to terrorism, particularly in Iraq and Nigeria. Further, we welcome UN entities designing effective strategies to prevent violent extremism that incorporate context-specific gender perspectives, as noted in the Secretary General's report. Addressing the threat posed by ISIS cannot be effectively done if women's voices and those of marginalized groups are not elevated as part of the process to fight violent extremism. Turning to Afghanistan, we take note of the Secretary General's assessment of ISIS Khorasan. The Taliban have made efforts to counter ISIS-K, and it is critical they adhere to their counterterrorism commitments. The Secretary General's report rightly recognizes that the fight against terrorism requires efforts beyond security-centered approaches. The international community must continue investing in whole-of-society approaches that respect human rights and the rule of law in order to effectively prevent and counter the spread of ISIS. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the United States for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of China.
Madam President,
首先感谢沃伦科夫
first of
副秘
all,
书
I'd
长
like to thank Under-Secretary
盖尔
General
曼执行主任
Voronkov, Executive
各位
Director
部长刚才
CTED,
所做的
German,
通报。
and Secretary General of
多年
Interpol
来，
Stock
联
for
合
their
国防
briefings.
恐办、
Over the
安理
years,
会防
the
恐
UN
执行
Office
局
of Counterterrorism,
国际刑警
CTED
组织
of the Security
积极
Council,
推
and
进
Interpol
国际防
have
恐
done
合
a
作，
great deal of
做了
productive
大
work
量有
as
效
committed
的工作。
champions and facilitators
中方
of
对此
international
表示赞赏。
counterterrorism cooperation, which China
当前国际
commends.
社会面临的
Today,
恐怖主义威胁
terrorism
依
remains
然
a
严峻。
dire threat to the
近期巴勒
international
斯坦发
community.
生两
The
起
two
恐怖袭
terror
击，
attacks that recently
再次
rocked
敲响了
Pakistan
警钟。
are a stark reminder
恐怖主义
that the
隐患，
scourge of
两
terrorism,
未消除。
often insidious, is far
中
from
方对
eliminated.
袭击予以
China
强烈谴
strongly
责，
condemns those attacks
坚定支
and
持巴
stands
基斯坦
squarely
为
behind
根除恐怖
Pakistan's
主义，
unflagging
实
effort
现社
to
会安全稳
eradicate
定
terrorism in
所
the
做的
interest
不
of
懈努力。
security and stability.
秘书长报告指出，
According to the UN Secretary
伊斯兰
General's
国及
report,
其附属组
Daesh
织
and its
仍然
affiliates
十分活
remain
跃，
active, very
其
active.
恐怖活动
Their
与
operations
种族
are
地区争
conflated
端
with
相
ethnic
互交织，
and regional
并利用
disputes.
加沙
They
紧
have
张局势
capitalized on the
煽动
tensions in
宗教不
Gaza
容忍，
to inflame religious
鼓动独狼
intolerance
式袭
and
击。
mobilize lone actors to
随着巴
commit
以冲
attacks.
突持续
As
升
the
级，
Palestinian-Israeli
其外溢效应
conflict
已
escalates,
导致
its
多国
spillover
仇恨
effect
犯
has
罪激
led
增，
to a surge in hate crimes
恐袭风
and
险
a
上升。
greater risk of terror attacks
当务之
in
急
multiple
是
countries.
加沙
Our
地
top
区
priority
尽
of the
快
moment
实现
is to
停火，
bring about a prompt
避免
ceasefire
中东局
in
势
Gaza to
滑向
halt
更加
the
危险
region's
的境
slide
地。
into greater peril.
面对复杂形势和艰
Confronted
巨任务，
with a
国
situation
际
this
社会必
complex
须
that
进一步
entails
加
an
强团
uphill
结，
struggle,
深
the
化
international
合作，
community has no
不遗
choice
余
but to
力
show
打
greater
击恐怖
solidarity,
主义。
intensify cooperation, and combat
第一，要
terrorism
秉持
with
正
no
确理
effort
念，
spared.
坚定
First,
政
we
治
must
决
show
心。
stronger political resolve
恐
matched
怖分
to
子
the
活
right
动范围
mindset.
广，
The
组织
footprint
网络
of
复杂，
terrorists is
人
far
员
and
流
wide.
动
Their
频繁，
network is complex and
仅凭
sophisticated,
一国之
and
力
they move
难
about
以
frequently, which
应
makes it
对
difficult
和
for any
根除。
given country to tackle and eradicate
国
them
际社
on
会
its
应
own.
秉持共
The
同、
international community
综
should
合、
uphold the
合
vision
作、
of common,
可持续
comprehensive,
的安全
cooperative,
关
and
系，
sustainable security,
支持联合
support the
国在
UN's
国际防恐行
central
动中
coordinating role
发
in
挥
international
核心协
counterterrorism
调作用，
operations,
全面
fully
落实安理会
implement
和
the
联大
relevant
相关决议，
Security Council
以及
and
联
General
合
Assembly
国
resolutions
全球
and
防
the
恐战略，
UN global
打
counterterrorism
击所有
strategy,
被安理会列
and
明的
combat
恐怖组
all
织
terrorist
和人
groups
员。
and individuals listed by this
恐怖
council.
分子没有好坏之
There are
分，
no good or bad
要坚决摒
terrorists,
弃
and we
双重
must
标准，
resolutely reject
反对
double standards,
要选择
oppose
性防恐，
selective
杜绝
counterterrorism,
将
and
防
put
恐
an
问
end
题政
to
治
the
化、
politicization
工具化
and
的做法。
instrumentalization of the counterterrorism agenda.
第二，要
Second,
突出重点
we
方
must
向，
focus
进
on
一
the
步
key
优化
areas
资源配
and
置。
further optimize resource
秘书长报告
allocation.
指出，
According to
阿
the
富汗
SG
境内
report,
恐
the
怖势力集
concentration
中，
of terrorist
伊
forces
斯
in
兰呼罗
Afghanistan
珊省
and the
与东
collusion
医院
between
等恐怖势
ICOK
力
and other
相互
terrorist
勾
groups,
结，
including
不
the
仅
Eastern
破坏
Turkestan
阿富
Islamic
汗安全
Movement,
形势，
or ETIM/DIP
威胁
for
地区
short,
和平
not only undermine
与安全。
Afghanistan's own security, but also
国际
threaten
社会
regional peace and
要
security.
对此保
The
持
international
高度
community
警
must
惕，
remain highly
团结
vigilant
一
in this
致，
regard
打
and
击
work as
所有
one
恐怖
to
势力，
combat all terrorist forces,
防止阿富汗
so
再度成为
that
恐怖主义
Afghanistan
集散地。
does not become once again a hub
非洲
for
长期
terrorist
处于
groups.
国际防恐前沿。
Africa has long been at the
西非
forefront
和
of
萨赫勒
international
地区
counterterrorism
恐怖
efforts.
形势
The terrorist
严
situation
峻，
in West Africa
防
and the
恐能力
Sahel
不
is
足
grim.
是
An
重要
important
原因。
reason of which is the lack of
联合国
counterterrorism
和国际
capacity.
社会要
The
结
UN
合
and the
非洲国
international
家
community
需
at
求，
large should take
给予
into account the
更大
needs of
资源
African
倾
countries
斜，
and prioritize
支持
resource
非洲
support
国家
in strengthening
加强
capacity
立法、
building at the
司法、
legislative,
执法
judicial
层面
and law
能力
enforcement
建设，
levels in those countries
提升
so
防
their
恐效果。
counterterrorism efforts are more effective.
第三，要坚
Third,
持综合
we
施
must
策。
be committed
致力
to a
于消
holistic
除恐怖
approach
主义
to
根源。
eliminate the root causes of
秘
terrorism.
书长报告
The
反
SG
复强
report
调，
repeatedly
仅靠安
underscores
全
that
手段
terrorism
无法
cannot be
根除
eradicated
恐
by
怖主义。
security means alone.
反恐必须树立
Counterterrorism counterterrorism efforts must be seen as an integrated, multi-pronged system that encompasses political, economic, judicial, social, and other means as a package. It is necessary to promote equal-footed dialogue, mutual learning, mutual appreciation, and harmonious coexistence among different civilizations and religions, and to reject the so-called clash of civilizations thesis. We must maintain our effort to find political solutions to hotspot issues and prevent terrorist forces from gaining strength and influence by exploiting conflict situations. We must promote sustainable economic and social development and break the vicious circle where poverty begets terrorism and terrorism leads to poverty. Emphasis should be placed on youth education and employment so that young people do not fall prey to the demagoguery of terrorist groups and go astray. Preventive counterterrorism, terrorism, and de-radicalization efforts should be actively pursued and efforts made to tackle the misuse of the internet to disseminate terrorist and extremist ideologies and reduce the space for their survival. Madam President, international counterterrorism cooperation has always been important to China, and we have been an active player in such cooperation. Through bilateral and multilateral channels, China has helped developing countries, African countries in particular, to strengthen their counterterrorism capacity building. Through the China United Nations Peace and Development Trust Fund, China has provided support for UNOCT and CTED counterterrorism projects. Recently, China issued a white paper entitled China's Legal Framework and Measures for Counterterrorism, which provides a systematic overview of China's practice and experience in enhancing rule of law in combating terrorism. Going forward, we will continue working hand in hand with the rest of the international community to fully implement the global security initiative unveiled by His Excellency President Xi Jinping, combat terrorism in all its forms, and jointly maintain international peace and security. I thank you, Madam
I thank
President.
the representative of China for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank USG Voronkov, Executive Director German, and the Secretary General of Interpol, Mr. Stock, for their briefings on the 18th report of the Secretary General on the threat posed by ISIL, Daesh, to the international peace and security. As a new Council member speaking for the first time on the theme of counterterrorism, please allow me to begin by reaffirming the Republic of Korea's position that any acts of terrorism are criminal and unjustifiable, regardless of their motivations, whenever, wherever, and by whomever. With regard to the SG's report, we share concerns that the threat of Daesh and its affiliates remains high, particularly in conflict zones, despite the commendable progress we have made to counter global terrorism. It is deeply worrying that Daesh is exporting terror beyond the region, including the recent deadly terrorist attacks in Iran and Pakistan, which they have claimed responsibility for. We are also particularly unsettled by the global terrorism landscape. Africa, particularly West Africa and the Sahel region, has become a terror epicenter. In Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan, Daesh has been successfully suppressed in recent years, but the risk of resurgence remains. In Europe, Daesh has attempted to tap into and exploit public sentiment using SNS, increasing the risk of potential attacks. In addition, we are facing growing threats posed by the use of emerging technologies such as social media and AI, new financial instruments, and unmanned aerial systems for terrorist purposes. To effectively respond to the rapidly evolving nature of terrorist threats, we must take a proactive approach that is more relevant and up-to-date. Against this backdrop, I'd like to share the following observations. First, in Africa, fatalities linked to militant Islamist violence claimed more than 23,000 lives in 2023 alone, with about 50% of such deaths in the Sahel. This is a near threefold increase since 2020, when the region's first unconstitutional change of government occurred. Daesh and its affiliates have exploited existing conflicts, political chaos, and grievances to increase their influence in the local roots, while using sexual and gender-based violence as a tactic of terrorism to advance their agenda. The expansion of Daesh and its affiliates in West Africa and the Sahel demonstrates that military actions alone cannot solve deeply entrenched problems. To address the underlying conditions conducive to the spread of terrorism, comprehensive approaches should be prioritized that invest in development and security capacities, strengthen the rule of law and human rights, and integrate gender perspectives. For its part, the Republic of Korea has contributed more than $18 million over the past decade to the AU's peace and security activities and joined the UN Joint Appeal for Counterterrorism in Africa initiative. Furthermore, Korea launched a multi-year development and peace-building project for the Sahel, totaling $20 million from 2022 to 26. Second, we encourage the better leveraging of UN counterterrorism sanctions to prevent terrorists from recruiting, securing funds, and trafficking illicit weapons. As evidenced in the Al-Qaeda case, sanctions are effective tools to countering terrorism that disrupt operations and curtail resources. However, the success of sanctions hinges on the commitment and the capacity of member states to implement them. In this light, CTAD plays a crucial role in assessing gaps in member states' counterterrorism capabilities and providing key technical assistance. Building on this, UNOCT should strengthen its strategic coordination role and monitor counterterrorism efforts within the UN Global Counterterrorism Compact. With respect to this, CTAD's visit to Korea last year was a valuable opportunity for us to review counterterrorism posture. We demonstrated well-established counterterrorism legislations, modernized border control, and strong cybersecurity capabilities with effective public-private partnership to prevent online radicalization and the spread of violent extremism. These measures were well received by CTAD, and we will work for further improvement. Third, new technologies bring opportunities for terrorism and counterterrorism alike. As such, we must remain ahead of the curve. We welcome the CTC's development of a set of non-binding guiding principles on UAS, ICT, and new terrorism financing. The Republic of Korea will actively participating in ongoing discussions on the CTC's principles and share its best practices and experiences in the field. The Republic of Korea announced its plans last year for an anti-drone system to prevent and disrupt drone terrorist attacks against critical infrastructure. We are also making efforts to update domestic laws to prevent terrorist financing through cryptocurrency. The recent cases of successful interventions to block such attempts in my country have highlighted the importance of global collaboration in addressing such abuse of new financial technologies for terrorism. Madam President, no one is immune from terrorism. It is particularly alarming that the current global instability, fueled by the wars in Ukraine, the Gaza, and the overlapping conflicts in the Sahel, is opening new opportunities and expanding dangerous breeding ground for terrorists. The Security Council, as the guardian of international peace and security, must harness its collective efforts to fight terrorism globally in a more effective manner. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank USG Voronkov, Executive Director of the Counterterrorism Committee, Executive Directorate Natalia Hellman, and Interpol Secretary General Jürgen Stock for their briefings. I also thank the Analytical Support and Sanctions Monitoring Team for its work on the report. Despite continued efforts by the Member States and UN entities, ISIL remains a serious threat to international peace and security. Terrorism causes greater instability in already vulnerable regions. Terrorists exploit fragile and unstable local security situations for their own purposes. Japan is deeply alarmed by the deteriorating and complex situation in conflict zones, including, but not limited to, the situations in West Africa and the Sahel. Madam President, with regards to combating terrorism, let me highlight the following 3 points. First, we must address the root causes of terrorism and violent extremism with a long-term and comprehensive approach. A security-centered approach alone is insufficient to counter this threat. Japan resonates the Secretary General's view expressed in his report regarding the necessity of comprehensive, multi-tiered, and multi-stakeholder responses that put the primary focus on preventing violent extremism conducive to terrorism. In this connection, we emphasize the importance of a holistic approach through the lens of human security by promoting the Humanitarian Development Peace HDP nexus. Japan is committed to support capacity building efforts in cooperation with member states and UN entities in this regard. The importance of the whole of society approach cannot be overstated. Such an approach allows us to address multifaceted challenges from diverse perspectives, ensuring that all stakeholders, including civil society, are engaged in a cohesive and coordinated response. In this vein, we encourage member states to incorporate the analysis and recommendations of the Counter-Terrorism Committee Executive Directorate assessment in their prevention strategies. Secondly, we need to address the challenges of people in vulnerable situations, especially women and youth, whose dignity and human rights must be respected. We are deeply concerned that women and girls are affected by sexual and gender-based violences committed by ISIL. In this vein, particular emphasis should be put on integrating a gender perspective. Neglecting gender considerations not only undermines the effectiveness of counterterrorism measures, but also risks worsening conditions that may foster terrorism and violent extremism. Therefore, it is crucial to integrate women, peace, and security considerations into counterterrorism efforts. This approach not only addresses the immediate impacts on terrorism on women and girls, but also empowers women and girls as pivotal players in conflict prevention and peace building, thereby fostering a more sustainable and lasting peace. Finally, Japan supports more effective usage of the 1267/1989/2253 sanctions regime, aiming to disrupt financial networks that sustain terrorist operations. It is imperative to cut off the means of financing of terrorism. UN sanctions are an important tool under the Charter of the United Nations in the maintenance and restoration of international peace and security. Japan calls on member states to fully and robustly implement sanctions measures to counter and prevent the threat posed by terrorist acts. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Japan for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Madam President, Mozambique wishes to express herself gratitude for the President for convening this discussion on the challenge posed for terrorist acts, international peace and security. We thank Mr. Voronkov, Under Secretary General for Counterterrorism, Ms. Gemon, Executive Director, and Mr. Stock, Secretary General for Interpol, for their valuable, important insights. We welcome the Secretary General's report on the threat of the Daesh poses on international peace and security and the range of the United Nations efforts in support of member states in combating these threats. Madam President, the persistent threat presented by Daesh continues to be a legitimate concern for the international community. Despite the significant setbacks, including the loss of his leader and cut lines of its financial networks, Daesh remains a formidable adversary capable of inflicting considerable civilian casualties and human suffering. These anti-degraded military capabilities in Iraq and in Syria have not eliminated the risk of its resurgence, nor have they prevented it from projecting a threat beyond the Middle East. To the contrary, we find ourselves at a critical junction as the volatility and conflict in the Middle East and in parts of West African continent, such as West Africa and Sahel, present opportunities for Daesh metastasize further. Daesh's ability to intertwine with ongoing conflicts, adapt swiftly, use technology, and merge with criminal networks presents a multifaceted challenge that requires a nuanced and a robust response. Madam President, although the international community has made steadfast progress in countering Daesh, largely owing to regional and international cooperation, we must not become complacent. The continuous need to adapt to the changing tactics and asymmetric threats posed by terrorist outfits and their kinetic cannot be overstated. We commend the pivotal role played by the United Nations through initiatives such as a Global Counterterrorism Coordination Compact, the Counterterrorism Committee Executive Directorate, as well as the response mechanism developed by Interpol, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, the Financial Action Task Force to tackle and eventually defeat international terrorist groups. These efforts rightly take into account the global nature of the threat and the necessity for a unified response. The use of cryptocurrencies and social media by Daesh on fundraising and mobilizing points to the need for vigilance and innovation to our counterterrorism strategies. Moreover, the development and implementation of effective counter-narratives and strategy to prevent counter-violent extremism are therefore crucial. We need to constantly stay ahead and attuned to transform the landscape of counterterrorism and leverage the opportunities offered by context-specific response around the globe. Madam President, one-size-fits-all response have proven to be counterproductive. We look forward to exploring the opportunities offered by Resolution 2719/2023 on financing African-led peace support operation to beef up Africa's response capabilities with a robust and enforcement mandate. We therefore welcome the Secretary General's emphasis in the new agenda for peace on the need for appropriate expertise to support counterterrorism operation through the creation of strategic action groups with support from United Nations Global Counterterrorism Coordination Compact in support of African Union peace enforcement operation. Africa has proven time and again to be capable of doing parts and giving the right tools proper assistance. Madam President, it is imperative that we continue to support comprehensive human rights and gender-sensitive programs to address the challenge in rehabilitating and integrating returning nationals. The protection of those most vulnerable, particularly women and girls who have suffered from sexual and gender-based violence at the hands of Daesh and other terrorist outfits, must remain a priority. We must strengthen our counterterrorism cooperation, share knowledge and best practice, and remain committed to a multi-tiered and multi-stakeholder response that respects human rights and the rule of law. In this context, Mozambique is committed to do its fair share and sustained efforts to efforts to combat terrorism with support of our bilateral, regional, and international partners, and collaboration with the United Nations and its counterterrorism bodies. In our endeavors, we steadfastly committed to obligation set forth within the framework of pertinent instruments of the United Nations, African Union, and the Southern Africa Development Community. To illustrate, in August 2023, the government of Mozambique ratified Law 1423, which established the legal framework and measures for the prevention and combat of money laundering and terrorist financing, and has undertaken series of security, legal, judicial, and administrative actions. As highlighted in the report, Mozambique Defense Forces, in partnership with the Southern Africa Community Mission in Mozambique, SAMIN, and the Rwanda Defense Forces, continue its relentless fight against the threat of terrorism, culminating most recently with the elimination of the operational leader in August 2023. To conclude, Madam President, we pledge Mozambique's continuous commitment in supporting the international effort and combating the endemic spread of terrorism by fostering and leveraging synergies resulting from international cooperation. Let us stand united in our resolve to confront this challenge and ensure a safe and more secure for all of us. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Madam President.
Благодарим заместителя генерального секретаря господина Воронкова
и
исполнительного директора госпожу Герман за доклады о деятельности веренных им ООНовских структур по борьбе с террористической угрозой. Высоко ценим усилия Управления ООН по контртерроризму и исполнительного директората контртеррористического комитета Совета Безопасности ООН. Продолжим и дальше оказывать всемирную поддержку их работе. С интересом выслушали
support for their work. We also listened with interest to the statement by Mr. Stock.
Внимательно изучили оценки, содержащиеся в докладе Генерального секретаря об угрозе ИГИЛ. Многие из них разделяем. Вместе с тем, документ мог бы выиграть от отражения в нем ряда существенных аспектов. Мы регулярно напоминаем о необходимости заниматься коренными причинами возникновения угрозы терроризма, а также о необходимости укреплять подлинное международное сотрудничество в борьбе с ним. Убеждены, что искоренить эту глобальную проблему не удастся до тех пор, пока террористы и экстремисты используются рядом западных государств для свержения неугодных режимов, прокси войнах или иным образом для достижения геополитических целей. Взять хотя бы современную картину распространения террористической угрозы со стороны ИГИЛ, Аль-Каиды и аффилированных с ними. Она четко указывает на сохранение и рост напряженности в регионах Ближнего Востока, определенных частях Африки и Афганистане. То есть именно в тех регионах, где имело место или продолжается значительное иностранное вмешательство во внутренние дела государств, в том числе под предлогом проведения контртеррористических операций. Подобное игнорирование суверенитета неизменно приводит к разрушению государственности, разгулу преступности, терроризма, экстремизма, массовой гибели мирного населения. Игры коллективного Запада в войну с террором и попытки разной степени успешности по свержению неугодных лидеров оставили кровавый и неизгладимый след в упомянутых регионах, который можно хорошо проследить в докладах Генерального секретаря. Но одной угрозой дело не ограничивается. Есть целый ряд вполне материализовавшихся сопутствующих проблем, которым в докладах Генсекретаря традиционно уделяется минимальное внимание. Например, For example,
Генеральный секретарь отметил, что, убегая из Афганистана, США и других государств НАТО бросили огромное количество вооружения, которое оказалось в руках игиловцев, аль-каидовцев и террористов. Ответственности за произошедшее никто не понес. Примечательно, что опыт Афганистана ничему не научил тех, кто осуществляет поставки оружия на Украину. Доподлинно известно, что значительная его часть разворовывается и в итоге оказывается в руках террористических группировок и транснациональных преступных организаций в Европе, Африке, Латинской Америке и на Ближнем Востоке. Это не добавляет стабильности и без того неспокойным регионам. Киевский режим — это коррупционная черная дыра. Поставки оружия ему становятся подпиткой террористов, транснациональных преступников и криминальных элементов по всему миру. Каждое государство, принимая предложение США поучаствовать в поставках вооружений в разжигании пожара на Украине, должно помнить, что это зло очень скоро вернется в ваш собственный дом. Особенно опасно и крайне недальновидно, когда к такого рода бездумным шагам пытаются присоединиться страны, имеющие серьезные проблемы с исполнением своих собственных контртеррористических обязательств, испытывающих криминальные вспышки на своей территории, такие, например, как Эквадор. Понимаем, что США сулят вам золотые горы, однако, как показывает жизнь, такие поставки — это только гибель людей, и далеко не только на Украине. Госпожа председатель, заслуживая в очередной раз известные заявления западных государств о важности защиты прав человека при осуществлении контртеррористических мер и необходимости соблюдения международного права, важно помнить о грубейших нарушениях прав человека при проведении Западом операций под контртеррористическим предлогом в Афганистане, Ираке, Сирии, а также в ходе многолетнего нахождения французских военных в Сахеле. О роли французов в регионе недавно подробно рассказал глава военного совета Нигера. Он сообщил, что, среди прочего, что французская разведка активно взаимодействует с местными террористическими группировками, чтобы дестабилизировать ситуацию в его стране. Внезапная забота представителей коллективного Запада о правах человека резко контрастирует с обычно используемым ими термином «сопутствующие потери», призванным закамуфлировать многочисленные жертвы среди мирного населения при неизбирательных бомбежках городов и якобы точечных ударах и террористов, осуществляемых самими родителями прав человека. Мы все помним о секретных тюрьмах ЦРУ, в том числе странах Евросоюза, о нечеловеческих условиях и пытках в тюрьмах Ирака, Афганистана, которые западные военные записывали на мобильные телефоны, чтобы хвастаться перед друзьями и родственниками. Нельзя забывать и о том, что до сих пор не закрыта спецтюрьма в Гуантанамо. Кто-то понес за это ответственность. Госпожа председатель, в завершении хотели бы затронуть еще несколько сюжетов. В докладе генерального секретаря отмечаются якобы успешные усилия ЮНИТА, следственной группы, призванной содействовать Ираку в деле привлечения к ответственности за преступления, совершенные ИГИЛ. В этой связи отметим, что Совет Безопасности, учредив ЮНИТА, обозначил его основной целью сбор и передачу Ираку доказательств для проведения справедливых судебных процессов, привлечения террористов к ответственности и обеспечения справедливости для жертв. С ключевым компонентом миссии ЮНИТА до сих пор проблема. Доказательству Ираку не передано. Местные правоохранители до сих пор не получили от ЮНИТАД вообще ничего, что можно было использовать в уголовном судопроизводстве. Искусственное затягивание реализации основной мандатной задачи ЮНИТАД приводит к тому, что судебные процессы над игиловцами годами не могут состояться. В итоге
Многие из них за
As a
это время
result, many of
успевают
them
убежать в
have
Ирак и
managed to
затаиться
flee
в
Iraq
других,
and hide
убежать
out
из Ирака и затаиться в других
in
странах.
other countries during this time.
Нельзя оправдывать продолжение неисполнения
The
ключевой
continued
части
failure
мандата,
to
полученного от
fulfill
Совета
a key part of the
Безопасности,
mandate received from
якобы
the Security Council
несовершенством
cannot be
законодательства
justified on the
Ирака.
grounds of
UNITAD
allegedly
обязан
flawed
передать
Iraqi
доказательства
legislation.
иракцам.
UNITAD has an
И должны
obligation
сделать
to
это
hand
до
over evidence
истечения
to
своего
Iraq,
мандата,
and it must do so
который
before
Совет
the end of its
Безопасности продлил
mandate,
в
which the
последний
Council
раз.
has renewed
У
for the
UNITAD
last
осталось
time.
меньше 9
UNITAD has less
месяцев,
than 9
чтобы
months
не
to
допустить
ensure
окончания
that
ключевой
a
части
key
своей
part of its
миссии
mission does not come
ничем,
to
то есть
nothing,
провалом.
which would represent a resounding failure.
В завершение хотели бы
To
отдельно
conclude,
подчеркнуть,
we would like to
что мы придаем
stress
большое
that we
значение тому
attach
вреду,
great
который
importance
наносит
to the
возможностям
harm
государств по борьбе с терроризмом
caused
односторонними
to states' ability
принудительными
to fight
мерами.
terrorism by unilateral coercive
Целый
measures.
ряд развивающихся
A number
стран
of developing countries
сталкиваются с этой серьезной
are
проблемой на
encountering this
ежедневной
major issue
основе.
on a daily basis.
В этой связи Россия
In this
созывает
regard,
встречу
Russia is
государств-членов Совета
convening
Безопасности
a
по
meeting
формуле
of
АРИА для
an ARIA
обсуждения
formula
важного
meeting of
вопроса
council members in order to
влияния
discuss the important
односторонних
issue of the impact
принудительных
of
мер на
unilateral
борьбу с
coercive measures
терроризмом.
on
Это
counterterrorism
мероприятие
efforts.
состоится 20
This
февраля,
event will
и
be
мы
held
приглашаем
on
всех
February
принять
20th, and
участие.
we invite
Благодарю
everyone to
вас.
attend. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for her statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of Algeria.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank Undersecretary General Voronkov and Executive Director German for their briefings. I also thank Secretary General of Interpol, Mr. Jürgen Stock, for his contribution. Our Secretary General's latest report on Daesh is deeply concerning. Daesh and its allies remain a serious threat, especially in areas of conflict in Africa and the Middle East. Though its ability to conduct attacks outside of its strongholds seems reduced, Daesh could easily resurge in Iraq and Syria if we reduce our effort to counter them. Additionally, Daesh's affiliates are growing in Africa. They are taking advantage of existing conflict. It is vital to remember that terrorism thrives in areas of political instability, underdevelopment, injustice. Successful long-term strategy against terrorism must absolutely address these root causes. We can't fight terrorism with military force or police force alone. We need to prioritize peace building, diplomacy, development, education, communication, and social medias to resolve the conflicts that gives this group a foothold. To defeat groups such Daesh, we need a global cooperation, collaboration with government, with regional institutions, and also with UN counterterrorism organization is crucial. Madam President, I wish to highlight from this standpoint some elements that we feel are of great interest to the fight against terrorism. First, we must synergize counterterrorism effort under a collective approach centered on the UN coordinating role. More transparency and engagement are needed in listing processes to ensure objective consideration of evidence submitted by member state. Second, addressing root causes, including lack of development, poverty, and unresolved regional conflicts. Who continuing providing fertile ground for terrorism. Political settlement alongside of investment in education, employment, and good governance are vital. Third, terrorist exploitation of emerging technology for communication, recruitment, and financing is deeply worrying. Similarly, link with organized crime require coordinating response. As the current chair of the Counter-Terrorism Committee, Algeria continue building on the foundation and achievement of previous tenure, including on the proposed guiding principle on information technology and digital payment. On the other hand, we champion action targeting all sources of financing, including ransom, and the connection between terrorism and transnational organized crime, in particular, drug trafficking. Finally, we shall actively support counter-terrorism capacity building assistance for vulnerable countries. And we will continue effort to implement the UN Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Madame la Présidente, j'aimerais exprimer notre reconnaissance pour le rapport du secrétaire général et remercier nos trois intervenants d'aujourd'hui pour leur présentation. Ce Conseil doit rester conscient de la menace que Daesh continue de représenter sur la paix et la sécurité internationale. Nous sommes notamment alertés par l'évolution de cette menace dans les zones de conflit et en particulier sur le continent africain. La convergence des conflits armés et du terrorisme, ainsi que la complexité du profil des acteurs, de leurs motivations et leurs objectifs, rendent l'élaboration de réponses adéquates et durables d'autant plus difficile. Je voudrais souligner trois aspects qui nous paraissent particulièrement importants dans ce contexte. Premièrement, les approches purement sécuritaires se sont souvent révélées inefficaces. L'action gouvernementale, accompagnée de violations des droits de l'homme, peut déclencher, alimenter et accélérer le recrutement par des groupes terroristes. Cela s'applique notamment au contexte déjà marqué par des conflits et un manque d'inclusion et de gouvernance. D'où l'importance d'adapter des stratégies holistiques et inclusives pour nous attaquer aux facteurs sous-jacents du terrorisme et de l'extrémisme violent pouvant conduire au terrorisme. Deuxièmement, la prévention et la lutte contre le terrorisme sont de la responsabilité première des États. Cela signifie aussi la responsabilité de respecter pleinement toutes les obligations du droit international, en particulier du droit international humanitaire et des droits de l'homme. Il s'agit de garantir une reddition des comptes, y compris pour les violences sexuelles et sexistes liées au terrorisme. Et surtout, il est important de nous prémunir contre tout nouveau griffe qui serait ensuite exploité par des acteurs terroristes. Il est crucial que nous rompions ce cercle vicieux. Troisièmement, il faut renforcer la confiance entre les acteurs de la sécurité et le public, comblant ainsi un fossé souvent exploité par les groupes terroristes et extrémistes violents. À cette fin, il faut une approche inclusive, sensible à la dimension du genre et établir un partenariat solide avec la société civile. L'approche nationale de la Suisse s'appuie sur la collaboration interdisciplinaire à tous les niveaux du gouvernement et avec les acteurs de la société civile. Afin de s'adapter aux évolutions, la Suisse évalue régulièrement son plan d'action national de lutte contre la radicalisation et l'extrémisme violent. La dernière édition, entrée en vigueur en 2023, met désormais un accent sur les jeunes et l'utilisation responsable d'Internet. Madame la Présidente, le secrétaire général l'a constaté, la réponse à la menace posée par Daesh et des entités affiliées nécessite des réponses globales, multiniveaux et multiparties prenantes en mettant l'accent sur la prévention. Faisons de la prévention une priorité politique comme le demande le nouvel agenda pour la paix, y compris dans la lutte contre le terrorisme. Je vous remercie.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I wish to join others in thanking USG Voronko, CTD Executive Director German, and the Interpol Secretary General Stock for their valuable briefing today. I also want to express our gratitude to the Analytical Support and Sanctions Monitoring Team for their contribution to the report. Madam President, reports about Daesh activities in West Africa, the Sahel, and Afghanistan, despite its reduced leadership and financial resources, are a reason for a serious concern. This adaptability underscores that the group is a persistent threat. The Islamic State in the Middle East showed how easily Daesh expanded by filling the void left in the absence of state governance. At the same time, we observe how Daesh is exploiting the situation in Gaza with public communications aimed at exacerbating religious intolerance and mobilizing lone actors to commit attacks globally. This is extremely dangerous. It is also worth noting the relatively easy access to weapons. The possibility of terrorist group obtaining modern weapons, such as armed UAVs, for example, is particularly worrisome. Financing of terrorism, as well as the nexus between terrorism and organized crime, requires our continued attention and cooperation. I wish to highlight, however, that we are particularly concerned about the widespread use of sexual and gender-based violence as a strategy and tactic in terrorist context. SGBV needs to be addressed with the same sense of priority as conventional forms of terrorism. This includes accountability, as well as support for survivors in their recovery. We commend the efforts by the CTED to focus on these issues in the recommendations. In considering counterterrorism approaches, I wish to share the following. 1. All counterterrorism efforts must be in accordance with the obligations of states under international law, especially international human rights law and international humanitarian law in armed conflict zones. The same principles apply to prosecution, rehabilitation, and reintegration processes. They must be undertaken through comprehensive, human rights compliant, and gender-sensitive programs. 2. This necessitates a whole-of-society approach with significant participation from civil society. To make the results sustainable, conditions conducive to the spread of terrorism and drivers of radicalization must be addressed. This includes the dire situation, especially for children, youth, and women in camps in northeastern Syria, to name just one. 3. Preventing impunity and ensuring accountability are essential, and national jurisdictions must develop appropriate framework and judiciously process available evidence, including the one from battlefields. At this point, we express our support for the work and mandate of the UN investigative team to promote accountability for crimes committed by Daesh. We also wish to call on a strict implementation of the sanctions adopted. Madam President, Slovenia condemns terrorism in all its forms and manifestations, no matter what pretext or justification. The terrorist threat is evolving, and terrorist groups and their narratives are adjusting to the new reality swiftly. Therefore, the international community must act likewise fast as well. In conclusion, Madam President, we recognize the need for a proactive and multi-phased international response. This includes the protection of human rights and the implementation of inclusive socio-economic strategies to build community resilience. International cooperation is key, and Slovenia will continue to contribute in the regional and global context. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone. To the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Madam President. And thank you for convening this briefing. Let me also thank the briefers, Under Secretary General for Counterterrorism, and Head of the UN Office of Counterterrorism, UNOCT, Vladimir Voronkov, and Executive Director of the Counterterrorism Committee, Executive Directorate, seated, Natalia German, and Secretary General of Interpol, Mr. Jürgen Stock, for their valuable briefings and contribution. Madam President, let me start by appreciating the analytical support and sanctions monitoring team pursuant to Resolutions 1526 and 2353 concerning Daesh, Al-Qaeda, and the Taliban, and associated individuals and entities, the CITED and UNOCT, for preparing this 18th report of the Secretary General, includes collaboration with other United Nations Global Counterterrorism Coordination Compact entities. I would like to highlight following areas of commendation and concerns: Africa, Afghanistan, Syria, robust measures to prevent radicalization and recruitment and counterterrorism. We note from the report that while Daesh continues to face leadership attrition and financial setback, Daesh and its affiliates retain their capacity to conduct terrorist attacks and project a threat beyond their areas of operations. We also note that the risk of their resurgence remains in Iraq and the Syrian Arab Republic, and the activity of Daesh's affiliates contributed to a deterioration of the situation in parts of West Africa and the Sahel. Madam President, on the African front, Sierra Leone is concerned with the evolution of the threats in conflict zones in Africa. Despite United Nations coordinated efforts in fighting terrorism, Daesh is spreading its activity particularly in West Africa and the Sahel, where existing ethnic and regional disputes and local grievances fuel terrorism. We note with serious concern the three broad tactical trends employed by Daesh as identified by the Secretary General in his report. We are particularly worried that these developing trends will allow these terrorist groups to allocate more resources to other targets. More concerning for us is that these developing trends may form part of a strategy to win the hearts and minds of the populations, where the group is active without actually reducing their operations. It goes without saying that these trends need to be urgently countered and addressed to avoid a significant rise in terrorist activities, especially in the Sahel region. The unconstitutional changes of government and current breakdown in engagement between ECOWAS and the central Sahelian countries of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger will make the fight against terrorism in the Sahel complex and more challenging, as it will lead to a significant deficit in counterterrorism capabilities. We look forward to an opportunity to explore transcontinental approaches to address security responses and preventive measures in country terrorism. Madam President, in Afghanistan, Sierra Leone notes a decrease in attacks by ISIL-K and commends the Taliban for the impact of counterterrorism efforts and a change in strategy directed by the group's leader. Sierra Leone is, however, concerned about the report that recruitment of Afghans to ISIL-K was substantial, with Afghans often being used for operations. This is deeply worrying not only for Afghanistan but also neighboring countries. We call on CTC and CITED to assist Afghanistan to employ a whole-of-society approach to counterterrorism in compliance with human rights and aligned with international law. We urge authorities in Afghanistan to adhere to its commitment in this regard. Madam President, on the Syrian front, while Sierra Leone commends the significant progress observed in a number of repatriations by a few member states, we remain concerned with the overall slow pace of repatriation efforts from camps in the northeastern Syrian Arab Republic. Sierra Leone deplores the holding of tens of thousands of people, mostly women and children, with alleged links to Daesh and other terrorist groups in detention facilities with dire humanitarian conditions in northeast Syria. We urge the states concerned to take measures to alleviate the serious humanitarian conditions that persist in the detention centers to prevent conducive conditions for Daesh to recruit from those camps. Additionally, we call on member states to repatriate their nationals for prosecution, accountability, rehabilitation, and reintegration programs in their home countries. Madam President, Sierra Leone underscores the importance of preventing terrorist exploitation, the radicalization, and recruitment efforts of Daesh. We reiterate that the underlying root causes of conflicts such as non-inclusion, religious intolerance, poverty, grievance, and sexual fear, terrorist recruitment. These issues are clearly capitalized on through the use of internet and social media platforms to spread propaganda, exploit grievances, manipulate vulnerable individuals, radicalize and recruit individuals by Daesh and other affiliated groups. We call on member states to address the root causes of violence and extremism, promote education, empower communities, engage in de-radicalization programs, promote religious tolerance, and foster social inclusion to counter the toxic ideologies propagated by Daesh. Sierra Leone joins the Secretary General to call on all member states to engage in dialogue with civil society and youths, including through its Connect and Learn platforms, which hosts more than 5,900 users from member states, international organizations, and civil society to prevent vulnerable individuals from falling prey to Daesh propaganda and the spread of terrorism. Madam President, Sierra Leone emphasizes the need for a comprehensive approach to address the multidimensional nature of the threat posed by Daesh. This includes robust counterterrorism measures, enhanced intelligence sharing, and cooperation among member states to degrade the organization's combat capability, dismantle its networks, and disrupt its financing. In line with this, we welcome the adoption of the first set of non-binding guiding principles for member states on threats posed by the use of unmanned aircraft systems for terrorist purposes, known as the Abu Dhabi Guiding Principles of S/2023/1035. To tackle the transnational nature of terrorism, we commend the efforts focused on promoting multilateral cooperation, in particular to address terrorist and other crimes, supporting prosecution efforts, as well as repatriating individuals still stranded in the northeastern Syrian Arab Republic. We urge all member states in their efforts to combat Daesh to respect human rights and international humanitarian law. Perpetrators of human rights abuses must be held accountable, following which they must go through rehabilitation and reintegration programs. To conclude, Sierra Leone acknowledges the critical role of the United Nations, including through the Global Counterterrorism Coordination Compact, for their continued support to member states in reinforcing their capacity to prevent and counterterrorism and violent extremism conducive to terrorism, including through addressing challenges stemming from terrorist groups exploiting conflict dynamics. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President. I also thank USG Voronkov, Executive Director German, and Secretary General Stock for their briefings. The 18th report of the Secretary General clearly underscores that while Daesh was effectively suppressed in Iraq and Syrian Arab Republic, it remained a serious concern and continues to wage asymmetric attacks, which unfortunately have increased since November last year. Moreover, we are alarmed by Daesh's efforts to exploit differences involving local populations. As the report highlights, Daesh's public communications in response to the events in Israel and Gaza since 7 October were aimed to exacerbate religious intolerance. This negatively affects the Security Council's efforts to achieving lasting peace in the region. Increasing terrorist activities in the region of the Sahel, Lake Chad, and the Horn of Africa remind us of the complex interplay between terrorism, armed conflict, climate change, aggravating food and water insecurities, the lack of socio-economic opportunities, as well as weakened national counterterrorism capacities. Risks to radicalization and recruitment by Al-Shabaab in Somalia are one such key example of this interplay, as well as the spread of terrorism from the central Sahel to coastal states in the Gulf of Guinea, which is increasing the risks of maritime insecurity. Malta is also concerned by the continued report of high concentration of terrorist groups in Afghanistan and the proliferation of weapons in circulation from stockpiles left. While expressing our condolences to the Afghani people, who are the primary victims of terrorist attacks in the country, we commend the mandate given to UNAMA to support regional and international efforts to tackle the illicit trade of small arms and light weapons from and into the country. Although there has been a decrease in the number of attacks perpetrated by ISIL-K, the group presents the greatest threat within Afghanistan, with the ability to project a threat in the region and beyond. Access to weapons and financing will continue to sustain terrorist acts. The report clearly emphasizes the vital sources of existence for Daesh and its affiliates, which need to be interrupted. Among these are cryptocurrencies, which are the predominant means for the financing of Daesh. Malta therefore strongly advocates for enhanced law enforcement cooperation in the financial crime and cyber security domains and calls for virtual assets service providers to align with international standards to counter terrorism financing. We also call for regulations which ensure the traceability of crypto asset transfers. President, addressing the terrorist threat requires comprehensive, multi-tiered and multi-stakeholder response anchored in human rights and the rule of law. We therefore advocate for meaningful engagement with the civil society, local communities, women and youth across all efforts to prevent and counter terrorism and violent extremism, and reiterates the call to ensure that responses to terrorism are fully consistent with international human rights standards and fundamental freedoms. In this regard, we call for strengthening child protection elements in counterterrorism policies in line with their special status. In particular, we call for all parties to treat children who have been recruited by terrorist groups primarily as victims, and if they face prosecution for committing crimes, for juvenile justice standards to be upheld. We continue to be appalled by the sexual and gender-based crimes committed by terrorist organizations. Gender equality and the women's empowerment must continue to guide the UN's and member states' prevention strategies. This must include the mainstreaming of gender perspectives, investing in gender-sensitive research and data collection, and strengthening the capacity of women and their civil society groups on the front lines of prevention. In this regard, we welcome UNICRI's recommendations on integrating context-specific gender perspectives in designing prevention initiatives in the Sahel and investing in women-led organizations. To conclude, preventing and countering terrorism and violent extremism is a priority we share. Malta remains fully committed to mitigate this scourge. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam
Je
President.
remercie les intervenants pour leurs exposés. Je souhaite insister sur deux aspects. Le premier, que le terrorisme, sous toutes ses formes et dans toutes ses manifestations, constitue une des menaces les plus graves contre la paix et la sécurité internationale. Les actes terroristes sont une menace pour nous tous. Notre réponse doit donc être forte et commune. Tous les continents sont concernés. Daesh, Al-Qaïda et leurs affiliés font preuve de résilience, aussi bien au Levant, en Afrique qu'en Afghanistan et en Asie centrale. Ils représentent une menace croissante au Sahel et autour du golfe de Guinée. Parce que tous les groupes terroristes prospèrent sur une multitude de facteurs. Violation des droits de l'homme, exclusion des femmes, fragilité économique, crise climatique, criminalité
crisis and environmental
Notre
crime,
doit être multiple.
our response must be
Cette réponse doit
multi-pronged.
être sécuritaire
It
et
must be
militaire,
a
et la France y
security
prend toute
and
sa
a
part,
military
mais
response,
doit
and
également
France is
traiter
playing
les
its full part
causes
here, but it must also address
humanitaires,
the
politiques,
underlying
économiques.
humanitarian, political, and
Elle doit
economic
s'inscrire dans le respect
causes.
de l'état de droit,
It
des
must
droits de
respect
l'homme
the
et
rule
des
of law,
libertés
human rights,
fondamentales.
and fundamental
En
freedoms.
cela, elle est aux
In this
antipodes des
sense, it is
agissements
the
du groupe
exact
Wagner ou de
opposite
ses
of the
émanations
actions of the
qui
Wagner
érigent les
Group and
exactions
its
massives
offshoots,
et la
which
prédation
make
économique
mass
en
atrocities and
principes cardinaux de leur
economic
action,
predation
ne
the core
faisant que renforcer
principles
le
of their
terrorisme
actions,
là où
thus
ils opèrent.
strengthening terrorism wherever they operate.
Deuxième point, Face à ce constat, nous poursuivons nos efforts dans 3 dimensions. Première dimension, lutter sans ambiguïté contre les groupes terroristes. La France demeure engagée tant dans le domaine militaire que civil dans la coalition contre Daesh avec ses partenaires. Cette mobilisation s'accompagne d'un engagement constant pour la protection des populations civiles, la stabilisation et la fourniture d'aide humanitaire en Irak et en Syrie. Au nom de l'intérêt supérieur de l'enfant, la France a procédé à de nombreuses opérations de rapatriement au bénéfice des mineurs français ainsi que de leurs mères lorsque cela conditionnait le retour des enfants. Deuxième dimension, la coopération internationale. Il nous faut mettre pleinement en œuvre les outils internationaux, à commencer par les sanctions du Conseil. La lutte contre le financement du terrorisme est une priorité. Les jalons de la réponse internationale ont été posés notamment dans la résolution 2462. Face à l'évolution des pratiques et l'utilisation par les groupes terroristes des nouvelles technologies, nous adaptons nos outils. Il est également essentiel de coopérer en matière de sécurité aux frontières. La mise en place du mécanisme intégré de stabilité des frontières, notamment par Interpol, est une étape positive. Nous appelons d'ailleurs à la poursuite de la pleine coopération entre Interpol et les entités onusiennes engagés dans la lutte contre le terrorisme. Nous devons aussi continuer de combattre la propagande terroriste en ligne. Nous poursuivons enfin notre lutte contre le terrorisme dans un cadre partenarial. C'est notamment l'objectif de l'Académie internationale de lutte contre le terrorisme d'Abidjan. Troisième dimension, enfin, lutter contre l'impunité des crimes commis par les groupes terroristes et notamment les violences sexuelles. La France reste mobilisée pour que les responsables répondent de leurs actes devant la justice. Elle soutient le travail d'UNITAD sur les crimes commis par Daesh en Irak. Nous n'oublions pas les femmes de la communauté yézidi qui, depuis 20 ans, subissent la barbarie de Daesh et des groupes terroristes qui l'ont fondée. La France s'est engagée à enquêter sur les crimes commis contre la communauté yézidi. Nous avons créé une juridiction spécialisée, le Parquet national antiterroriste. La France continuera à apporter sa contribution au Fonds mondial pour les survivants et survivantes de violences sexuelles liées au conflit et à soutenir les efforts de lutte contre l'impunité.
And to support efforts to combat impunity. I thank you.
I thank the representative of France for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Gracias, señora presidenta.
Thank you, Madam President. I'd like to thank the Secretary General of Interpol, Mr. Jürgen Stock, and Secretary General Voronkov, and Executive Director German for introducing the report of the Secretary-General on the threat posed by Islamic State Daesh to international peace and security. As is contained in the report, despite the reduction in its operational capacity and losses of leadership, Daesh and its affiliated entities continue to pose a threat to international peace and security. This has been demonstrated by the deadly attacks seen in West Africa, the Sahel, and the Middle East. Conflict zones are particularly vulnerable to the activities of Daesh and its affiliated entities, where the lack of institutions and the absence of the rule of law allow them greater operative, financial and logistical autonomy. In this regard, the report warns us of the risk of the establishment of a zone of instability which could extend from Mali to the border areas of Nigeria. This risk highlights the importance of continuing to pool efforts to counteract Daesh and to strengthen counter-terrorism cooperation. For Ecuador, sexual violence as a terror tactic is to be condemned, and it must be rejected by the entire international community. Fighting terrorism funding should also be an essential component of these efforts, and that is why my country supports the work of the International Financial Action Task Force and its global network, as well as an exchange of information between states. Additionally, we believe it's fundamental to continue with the implementation of Resolution 2462, adopted 5 years ago, and which is the first comprehensive resolution to be adopted by this Council on the fight against terrorism funding.
La ausencia técnica orientada a mejorar las capacidades nacionales, la asistencia técnica orientada a mejorar las capacidades nacionales de lucha contra el terrorismo continúa siendo fundamental para muchos países. Alentamos a la Oficina de las Naciones Unidas contra el Terrorismo, a la Oficina de las Naciones Unidas contra la Droga y el Delito y demás agencias a continuar respondiendo de manera efectiva y coordinada a las solicitudes de asistencia técnica de los Estados. Por otra parte, la asistencia y la amenaza que plantea Daesh pone en evidencia los límites de los enfoques centrados en la seguridad. La construcción de sociedades más justas e igualitarias que proporcionen servicios básicos de calidad a su población, así como oportunidades para su juventud, deben ocupar un lugar prioritario en nuestros esfuerzos para contener la propagación de la amenaza del terrorismo. Por tanto, una estrategia integral contra el terrorismo debe incorporar también una visión de desarrollo. Para concluir, Ecuador se suma a la preocupación expresada por el secretario general por las precarias condiciones que enfrentan las personas recluidas en los campamentos en el noreste de la República Árabe de Siria, muchas de las cuales son mujeres y niños, y hace un llamado a que se garantice el acceso a la asistencia humanitaria. Muchas gracias.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. Let me thank Under-Secretary General Voronkov, Executive Director German, and Secretary General Stock for their briefings today. I also thank the monitoring team for their work on the report. The United Kingdom remains deeply concerned at the prospect of Daesh resurgence in the Middle East. As the report notes, though the threat in Iraq and Syria has been effectively suppressed, it remains a serious threat. Iranian-aligned militias continue to attack the coalition forces that are directly working to remove Daesh's malignant influence in the region, in partnership with the government of Iraq. The United Kingdom calls on Iran to use influence to stop these attacks and de-escalate regional tensions. It is in all our interests to prevent Daesh from projecting its poisonous ideology and inflicting death and destruction across the region. Turning to Africa, the UK is deeply concerned at Daesh's growing presence across the continent. We stand ready to support our African partners and intensify efforts to improve coordination and strengthen regional cooperation. UN entities play an important role. We welcome their cooperation with the African Union to build capacity and squeeze the spaces in which violent extremist networks can flourish. We also encourage cooperation between UN Global Counterterrorism Coordination Compact members, and we welcome Interpol's role in this. Finally, we must not ignore the disproportionate impact terrorism has on women and girls. This year, we mark the 10th anniversary of atrocities committed against the Yazidi people. We commend the important work done by UNITAD with the support of the Iraqi authorities to investigate sexual crimes by terrorists against women and girls. President, we know that Daesh thrive in divided, fragile and unstable environments. We all have a responsibility to counter their ideology and provide an alternative future. Thank you.
I shall first thank the representative of the United Kingdom for his statement, and I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Guyana. I would like to thank USG Voronkov and Ms. Germain for their updates and acknowledge their efforts in the preparation of the report being considered today. I also thank the Secretary General of Interpol, Mr. Jürgen Stock, for the insights provided. We recognize and appreciate Interpol's important role in combating terrorism and its strong collaboration with the Security Council. Guyana takes note of the Secretary General's report and the worrying trends identified concerning the activities of ISIL. We remain primarily concerned about some of the key trends highlighted in the report, including the escalation of threats of terrorism and violence in West Africa and the Sahel, and rising threat levels in Europe, the increased lethality of terrorist attacks, the development of unmanned aerial systems technology and their weaponization, the proliferation and illicit trafficking of small arms and light weapons, and increased use of improvised explosive devices, and the increased use of cryptocurrencies to finance terrorist activities. Guyana joins the international community in condemning all forms and manifestations of terrorism and remains deeply committed to addressing this grave challenge in a manner consistent with international law, international human rights law, and the Charter of the United Nations. Terrorism continues to pose a clear and present danger to the stability and security of nations. Its impact transcends borders and affects communities indiscriminately, thriving especially in conflict areas. It also disrupts the social fabric of communities and undermines the rule of law. Further to its effects on nations, terrorists engage in sexual and gender-based violence, including rape, torture, and sexual slavery. In UNITAD's report on sexual violence against women and girls committed by ISIL in Iraq between 2014 and 2017, it was noted that ISIL used sexual violence exclusively against women and girls. To this end, there is a need for concerted, collaborative efforts to counter terrorism and its pernicious impacts on global peace and security. This also means ensuring increased representation of women in the decision-making processes for anti-terrorism laws and policies, and having specialized units within security forces and the justice systems that can provide training to investigate sexual violence as a tactic of terrorism. In addressing this scourge, it is also necessary to adopt preventive measures that address the root causes, including poverty, marginalization, and lack of access to education and economic opportunities, among others. Guyana underscores the need to hold the various actors of terrorism, including their financiers, perpetrators, organizers, and sponsors accountable. We also urge the international community to support, multiply, and enforce all efforts directed toward the eradication of terrorism. In this vein, we acknowledge the pivotal role of the United Nations agencies and organs and Interpol in combating terrorism and fostering a coordinated, multilateral response to this global challenge. We support all initiatives aimed at bolstering the capacity of member states to combat terrorism, fostering dialogue and cooperation, and championing strategic partnerships to comprehensively counter this threat. In closing, I wish to reiterate Guyana's unwavering commitment to working collectively with the international community to combat the scourge of terrorism and safeguard international peace and security. I resume my function as President of the Council. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.